Hello, good evening. It's Thursday. Welcome to another reading from the Scargatherer series. I was just thinking, just before I switched on, about what I might say at the beginning of this video, just to give one or two people a chance to come and join us. And I was thinking the trouble is that because we're all stuck at home, all the days are the same, just like I was saying yesterday. I did go out yesterday, so that felt really strange, but it's all much the same. I've been in the garden a bit, because we're lucky enough to have a garden, so I've been doing some weeding, and I've been sitting in the garden reading, actually, for the last hour or so. I'm reading a book called The Book Thief, which is by Markus Zusak. It's about the Second World War, which is something that has always been a total fascination for me, pretty much since the first time I ever really started to learn about it at school, probably about the age some of you are. So yeah, I'm just loving, I've read The Book Thief before, but I'm rereading it, and I'm just absolutely loving it. It's told from the point of view of death, and he's got a very distinctive voice, and he gives little sort of asides as he's talking and that kind of thing, which I absolutely love it. And it's about a little girl, she's not little, a girl called Liesel, and the young Jewish man who is hidden in the basement of their house. It's fabulous, but I do love death. Terry Pratchett writes about death quite often as well. I don't know if any of you have read any Terry Pratchett, but death in Terry Pratchett has, he always speaks in capitals, and I really like that too. Anyway, we are on chapter 4 of Saving the Unicorn's Horn, so we're in Viking times, as you know. Joe has had to milk the goat, which didn't go well. This is something I found really interesting about writing these books, is I then have to find out how to do these things, and I watch a lot of YouTube videos and things like that of people explaining about how to milk a goat, for example, and hobbling them, so you put a strap around their back legs so they can't kick the milk bucket over. Because for people in the past who would keep a goat for milk, actually then it's really important to get the milk. That's why we have the phrase, there's no use crying over spilt milk. Spilt milk mattered in the past in a way that it doesn't matter to us now. So Joe's had to milk the goat. He's now going out with Lucy. One of their tasks is to collect moss, if you remember, for the for the loo roll, basically. They don't have loo roll. In Roman times, if you've listened to the Leopard in the Golden Cage, they used a sponge on a stick. You might know that anyway. In Viking times, it's moss. So yeah, they've got to collect some moss. But on their way out of Jorvik, they have seen this boy that Joe recognises really, really clearly as Tiberius, his sworn enemy. He's got fair hair now, but everything else about him is the same. We don't know what his name is here. Lucy is clearly really nervous seeing this boy, and she makes them go out of the city a different way so that they can lose the boy, so that he doesn't know where they've gone, because if he does, he'll be waiting for them when they come back. So they're on the way through the city trying to get rid of this boy who they've seen. Chapter 4. For the next 10 minutes they hurried along tracks and down alleyways, and even stumbled along one of the passages between the buildings, which was piled high with rotting rubbish. Joe was soon utterly disorientated. "Wait for me," he yelped, slipping into a puddle as he tried to keep up with Lucy. "I've no idea where we are. I'll never find my way back." She paused for a moment. "Jorvik's not that big," she said. "If you do get lost, just ask for Coppergate, or if you can't remember that, the Street of the Coopers." She looked up and down the track they had just come to, then darted out along it and onto a wooden bridge across a river. On the other side she turned immediately down another track. Despite what she had just said, it seemed to Joe that the city went on and on. Finally they came to a gate in the city wall, like the one she'd been coming through when he met her yesterday evening. "Right," she glanced over her shoulder. "Out through here, quickly, then we should be fine." The city was some way behind them before Lucy slowed down. Joe hitched up the basket on his back, glad to be allowed to walk at a normal pace again. Who was that boy then? Lucy looked down at herself and then at Jo. Her pinafore and the skirts of her dress were streaked with muck and her shoes were filthy. Jo's trousers and shoes were the same. "Oh dear," she said, pulling her face. "I think we'd better go to the river this morning and wash the worst of this stuff off so that it can dry during the day. My mother won't be happy if I go back like this." "I don't understand, though. Why did we have to do that?" "Jorvik has 3 gates in the city walls," she said. "It was obvious which one we were heading for, so it's quite likely that Thorbjorn would have been waiting for us this evening if we hadn't crossed the river to a different one. He probably won't come now, because he won't know which of the 2 gates to wait at." "Thorbjorn, did you say?" Jo thought about the name. That could be an equivalent Danish name for Tiberius, he supposed. The other names hadn't been an exact match after all. Matthias for Marius and Surka for Salustia. But they were always sort of similar, just as the people themselves looked broadly similar, even if their hair or eye colour was different. "He's my cousin," Lucy said, "but he hates my family. If he catches us this evening, he'll take everything we've collected today, and most likely give me a thick lip in its place." "He'd hit you?" Jo was incredulous. "I would never hit a girl, especially one younger than me." Lucy smiled ruefully. "Perhaps it's like you were saying before we saw him. Things are different here to what you're used to." Jo stopped to take a piece of flint out of his shoe. "So why does he hate you, if you're cousins?" Lucy waited for him, flicking with a twig at a strand of something brown and slimy on her skirt. "It's a long story," she said. "Tell me, we have all day, don't we?" As they walked on again, Lucy began to explain. "For 3 generations," she said, "there was a feud between my father's family and another family. That was back in the homeland, across the water, before anyone ever came here. The story goes that it started because of a girl. They had crossed a field and were walking now along a belt of trees." Lucy paused to pick some nuts. Jo watched for a moment, then began to pick them from one of the other branches, throwing the soft green casing on the ground as Lucy did. "Put them in here." Lucy nudged her basket towards him with her foot. "We'll keep your basket for the bigger things. Anyway," she went on, "this girl married my great-grandfather, which caused a big argument because the other family said that she'd been promised in marriage to their son." "What did she want? The girl, I mean?" Jo asked. "She wanted to marry my great-grandfather." "Why argue over it then? Why would you fight to marry someone who didn't want to marry you?" Lucy laughed. "You really are from another world, aren't you? The other family saw it as a matter of honour. Their son's bride had been stolen, so in revenge they killed all my great-grandfather's horses." "But that's awful." They finished collecting the nuts and went into the wood to find the first of Lucy's traps. "It got worse from there," she said. "One of my great-grandfather's brothers was so furious that he went and set fire to the other family's house and burned it to the ground." "No!" "So then the man who'd been jilted in the first place killed my great-grandfather's brother." Jo stared at her. "All because of a woman?" Lucy nodded. "After that, it was a bloodbath," she said, matter-of-factly. "Someone from our family killed someone from theirs. They killed another one of ours, and so on. And it didn't stop with that generation either. My grandfather was killed, one of my great-uncles. Then when my father and his brothers became men, one of my uncles killed one of the young men from the other side." Jo shook his head. "That's crazy." "To you, maybe. Anyway, the community decided that something had to be done, so it was agreed that one of my father's sisters would be married to the brother of the young man my uncle had killed." Jo rubbed his forehead. "Let me check I've got that right. They linked the families by marrying your father's sister to the dead man's brother." "That's right." Lucy bent down and moved the drift of leaves aside from the trap. "Empty," she said, covering it back over. "So that was supposed to put an end to it. And it worked, sort of. There haven't been any killings since. But the thing is, Thorbjorn was the son of the dead man. He was adopted by his uncle, who then married my father's sister. How old was he when this happened? I'm not sure. It was before I was born. I don't think he was more than 4. Do you think he even remembers his real father? Maybe, maybe not. That's the problem, though. He feels my family took his father away from him. He's never forgiven us. But your family is his family too, isn't it? His mother is your aunt. She's his adopted mother, though. His real mother died in childbirth. They walked out towards the open ground again. Look, hawberries. Lucy pointed at a bush on the edge of the wood. We'll pick some of those and put them in your basket for now, then tip them into mine later. Otherwise they'll get squashed like the ones I picked yesterday. Joe stood beside her, thinking about Thorbjorn and the feud, while he picked the small red berries from amongst the thorns. Something similar had happened before with Tiberius, or at least Tiberius had hated Lucy's family just as much. Leave the very small berries, she said. They'll be really sharp, and we can't afford to use too much honey sweetening them. What about sugar? What's sugar? You know, the white stuff that looks like salt. Joe glanced across at his friend. Lucy's face was completely blank. Never mind, he carried on, picking. So, do you always have to keep away from Thorbjorn? Lucy cocked her head. What did you just call him? Forget it, I got muddled. Oh, no, not always. She dropped a cluster of berries and bent to pick them up from the ground. It's just been the last few weeks, really. He's never liked us. That's always been obvious. But when his uncle and my father are at home, it's fine. Even when they were both away raiding in the spring, it was all right, because Matthias was at home. He's a year older than Thorbjorn. There was a fight, but Matthias won, and that was that. But of course this time Matthias has been away as well. Her face was suddenly anxious. Thorbjorn has already had all of Pedder's fish a couple of times. Pedder came home with a black eye the second time. What did your mother say? She was angry, of course. The first time Pedder came home empty-handed, she went straight round to see my aunt, who gave the fish back. Pedder thought that was why Thorbjorn punched him the second time. He pleaded with my mother not to go and see my aunt again. Lucy shrugged. She still went, but that time Thorbjorn had already sold the fish, so my aunt couldn't do anything anyway. They moved along the hedgerow, still picking the hawberries and throwing them into Joe's basket. I'm scared of what he'll do if he catches me, Lucy said. He's so much bigger and stronger than I am. It couldn't be that bad, though, could it? She emptied her hands and pulled at a long leather string, which Joe hadn't noticed, hanging down beneath her pinafore. Attached to it was a small case carved out of bone. Everyone carries a knife here, she said, opening the case and showing it to him. Wow, isn't that dangerous? It could be. We use our knives for cutting up food or gutting fish or for foraging like today, if we had to cut an animal free from a trap. So they do have to be quite sharp, otherwise they'd be no good. Joe had a sudden vision of Thorbjorn towering over Lucy, a blade gleaming in his fist this time in place of the stylus he'd had before. Was this what people meant when they talked about history repeating itself? He gulped and blinked the vision away. He said, more confidently than he felt. At least, not while I'm around. As he said the words, a thought struck him. It was impossible to predict how long he would stay in Lucy's world each time. He might not be around for much longer, and if he wanted to return, he had to give her the key so she could call him back. In fact, he said, I'm going to give you something to help protect you. He unfastened his St. Christopher from round his neck. What's that? She gazed at it. It's beautiful. And where did you get such a fine chain? Joe smiled. They're quite common where I come from. He put it round her neck and fastened the catch. Think of it as a lucky charm. But I can't keep it. Her eyes were wide. It must be really precious to you. It does mean quite a lot to me, but you need it at the moment. One day, when you've finished with it, I'll have it back. He swallowed. It felt risky, giving the St. Christopher away like this, but it had worked last time, and it clearly had something to do with the time travel, since dropping it was how he'd arrived here. She put up her hand and touched the little silver disc. Then she tucked it beneath the neck of her dress. "Thank you," she beamed. "I promise I'll look after it." "Good. Now," he said, changing the subject, "I'm hungry. We didn't bring any lunch with us, did we?" "Lunch? You mean something to eat? We don't have a meal in the middle of the day, just mornings and evenings." "Really?" He was aghast. She grinned. "I do usually find something I can eat while I'm out, though." Joe tried a Horbury and made a face. "Those are better cooked. You could eat a few of the hazelnuts we picked earlier. We can open the shells with my knife. Or we might find an apple tree." "What about the one you went to yesterday?" "That was crab apples, and anyway, it's on the far side of the city," she said, "through the gate we didn't go out of." "How about rabbits? If we could catch one, we could cook it, if you know how to make a fire." She shook her head. "Fire is really difficult, except when the weather's been dry for ages. Anyway, what's a rabbit?" "It's like a small hare." "A baby hare, you mean?" "No, it's a different animal." She looked at him blankly again. "You know, I just can't get used to this," he said, "even after last time." "Last time?" "The time we met that you don't remember." He laughed at the look on her face. "All these things we eat every day where I come from that you don't have, like potatoes and tomatoes and sugar and rabbits. I thought rabbits were everywhere, whether you wanted to eat them or not. I still find it really strange." She frowned at him, perplexed. "Never mind," he said. "Can I borrow your knife and open a few nuts?" Somehow the hours slipped past. They came to the river and washed the mud from their clothes and shoes, which squelched on their feet while they collected moss. Joe ate too many sour apples, so that his stomach grumbled for half of the afternoon. And Lucy found a partridge in one of her traps and deftly twisted its neck before throwing it into Joe's basket. They collected wood for the fire and more nuts and berries, and started to make their way back as the sun dipped in the sky. As they came up to the city walls, Joe realised his friend had grown anxious again. While he was still chatting, she had fallen silent and was looking around them all the time. In the dusk, they slid in through the great gateway and crossed the city like shadows, keeping to the edges of the tracks. When she pushed open the door of her house, he heard her give a huge sigh, as though she'd been holding her breath for the last 10 minutes. Inside the house, it was just like the evening before. Sorka and Peder and Anya were already there. Sorka was working this time at a large wooden frame that stood up against the back wall. Her long hair was tied up at the nape of her neck, and she leaned towards the frame as she slid something flat between the taut threads. It must be a loom, Joe guessed. Nearer the fire, Anya stood beside a basket of wool that she'd been picking over, drawing out yarn and spinning it drawing out yarn from the fleece and spinning it onto a wooden spindle. In the flickering light, her eyes were fixed on the yarn, but she seemed not to see it, as though she were lost in a trance. Lucy and Joe put their baskets down on the table. Although they had eaten quite a lot of the apples and nuts as they picked them, and hadn't caught anything as large as yesterday's hare, Joe was pleased to see that both baskets were still noticeably fuller than the previous evening. "Well done, children," Lucy's mother said, sorting through the contents. "Louis-Jacques, could you carry on draining this cheese while I deal with the nuts and fruit? Joe, could you take the moss out to the yard? You'll see a basket for it out there." Outside, the sky was dark, and there was no moon. As he came out through the back door, Joe thought he saw a movement in the shadows beside the goat shelter. "Hello?" he called. There was no reply. He stared into the darkness along the end wall of the house. The goat stamped its hooves and blew air out through its nostrils. That must have been it, he decided, just the goat. After walking home with Lucy the last part of the way, he'd started seeing danger where there wasn't any. He walked purposefully down to the wattle screens. On the inside of one was a basket. He stuffed the armful of moss into it, pressing it down as it sprang back out. Suddenly, there was an arm around his throat. He staggered backwards. His head was wrenched up painfully. "Who's that?" he choked. "I could ask you the same," snarled a familiar voice. "Who are you?" Joe made himself relax all the muscles for a couple of seconds, as though he didn't have the will to fight. Then he twisted abruptly, digging his fingernails into the arm at his throat. Caught off guard, the other boy let go. Joe spun round to face him. It was Thorbjorn. "I might have known," he muttered to himself. "Known what?" The older boy stepped closer again. Even in the gloom, Joe could see his teeth. "That it would be you. You don't change, do you?" Joe said. "What are you doing here?" Although the other boy was quite a lot bigger than him, just as Tiberius had been, Joe found he was less frightened than he'd been before. Perhaps it was because he felt like he knew his enemy. He put his hand down to the scar on his thigh. Tiberius had managed to wound him last time, but he had won in the end. "Who are you?" Thorbjorn snarled again. "You were with my cousin Luishak today, but I haven't seen you before." "I'm an old friend. My name's Joe." He watched Thorbjorn's face for any flicker of recognition. There was none. It was so strange to know all these people when they didn't know him. "Well, Joe," the boy said with mock friendliness, "since you're here, you can do me a little favour." "Why would I help you?" "You don't have to help, exactly. I've come round to pick up these chickens." "I'm not giving you a hand to get them in a basket. They're not yours." "Quite right. What you're going to do is take the blame for me." Thorbjorn laughed sourly. "No way!" Joe cried in outrage. Too late, he realised he'd backed himself up against the wattle wall. Thorbjorn stepped quickly forward. His nose was inches away from Joe's. "Hush," he crooned. In one swift moment his hand was at Joe's throat again. "We don't want them to hear you inside, do we?" Joe felt a cold, hard edge against his skin. It was just as Lucy had feared. Thorbjorn had drawn his knife. So that's the end of chapter 4. What do you think will happen? It depends whether you've listened to or read The Leopard in the Golden Cage. If you have, you've probably got some idea of what might happen now. If not, take a guess. And then come back tomorrow, 5 o'clock tomorrow, and find out the answer. In the meantime, if you want to find out anything about Vikings, there are recipes actually on this webpage. This is my website that is associated with this series. So there's recipes on there. I haven't actually tried, but actually, now I think about it, this would be a perfect time. There was one for Viking flatbreads that you cook over a fire, and one for some berry pancakes. So maybe I'll finally get round to doing that while we're all stuck at home. Might be a moment to actually do it. On my website, there's a little picture of on the Viking recipe page, there's a picture of a stick boy and a stick girl that I think I drew and just slotted them in there because I thought, oh, I'll put up, I'll make these recipes and then I'll take a photograph and put the photos up with the recipes when I've done it. And that's, if you look, I think it says that that's what I'm intending to do. That's 5 years ago, maybe? Even longer, perhaps. I can't quite remember. Anyway, a long time ago. So this might be the moment where I finally make Viking flatbreads and berry pancakes. Anyway, 5 o'clock tomorrow for chapter 5.